The November jobs report from the Bureau of Labor Statistics released this week showing some staggering numbers in unemployment. The latest data finds that despite a job opportunity increase, nearly 700,000 women are still missing from the workforce. And for Black women, the unemployment has surged to roughly 7.5%, outpacing the broader workforce and sounding an alarm for the U.S. labor market. Award-winning gender economist Katica Roy recently released her analysis of these numbers, and she joins us now for more. Katica, thank you for being with us, as you have been before, to really break down what this means. Talk to us about what this crisis does show for the entire economy.
Well, you know what we're actually seeing is that if you look at Black women alone, Black women have lost almost 300,000 jobs, while men have gained 600,000 jobs. You're talking about a swing of almost 1 million jobs. That is not a slowdown. That is a redistribution of opportunity.
That is fascinating to hear you put it that way. And because most people would say, listen, these aren't 700,000 women who are just missing or electing to leave the workforce. Most of them were fired or pushed out, right? Is that what you would say?
Absolutely. That's exactly what we've seen. So when we look at since the pandemic, 700,000 women overall are missing from the labor force. And in that same time frame, over 6 million women have actually become eligible to participate in the labor force. So reasonably, you would think that their labor force participation should increase, but that's not what we're seeing. And just since February, we've seen almost 100,000 men join the labor force. So you're really talking about not a personal choice. You're talking about structural exclusion.
So why are Black women, you think, being affected at this level? And do you think that it seems that they're being specifically targeted?
Well, that's what, I can't speak to what exactly is happening in terms of being specifically targeted. What I can tell you is that the numbers are staggering. When we look at Black women, over 600,000 have been economically sidelined. One of the things that we look at is that if you compare it to white women, Black women's labor force is about 5 times smaller than white women. If white women had been economically sidelined at the same rate as Black women, we would be talking about over 3 million white women. That's the entire labor force of Pennsylvania. I mean, this impact is massive.
That is so striking, especially when you put it, that simply in terms of the size of the workforce for white women in the state of Pennsylvania. Massachusetts Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, she called the rising unemployment rates of Black women a canary in the coal mine, an economic indicator for everyone else. Why is that? What should anyone else glean from these numbers we're seeing?
Well, there's 2 things that are happening, Ron. One of the things that we know from the numbers is that because Black women sit at the intersection of gender and race, they tend to be the first impacted, but they really are the signal for the entire economy. And we have seen that. The other piece is that their labor force, it doesn't just impact Black women. Their forced labor force exits this year alone have cost us $9.2 billion in GDP growth. So you're talking about impacts to Social Security, Medicare, the solvency of banks, the solvency of insurers. This will impact everybody.
Katica, what would you say to someone who maybe sees these numbers and says, I don't think that Black women are being targeted. Maybe this is just sort of a coincidence to see this number. Maybe it's their job performance. What would you say to someone who is skeptical in that way?
The data does not vet that out. What the data shows is that Black women are the most educated cohort in the United States. In fact, they are more likely to be underemployed, not because of their own doing, but because they are undervalued in the labor force. That's one of the reasons why we saw that there was a huge representation, or has been historically a huge representation of Black women in the federal labor force, and they were disproportionately impacted by the cuts.
So what needs to change systematically to close this economic gap that we're seeing?
Well, one of the things that, you mentioned Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, and one of the things that she has talked about is demanding that the Fed actually talk about the real unemployment rate, right? So the unemployment rate overall for the latest jobs report was 4.5%. If you look at it for Black women, it's actually 7.5%, which is 70% higher than what the Fed considers full employment. But if you include the labor force exits of Black women this year, their unemployment climbs to over 10%, or in plain language, over 2 times what the Fed considers full employment. So we need to demand that the Fed and that our policymakers are operating off of data. Otherwise, it undermines the economy for everyone.
And you're saying it ends up being a much bigger problem than we even realize along the way. Gender economist Katica Roy, thank you so much for being with us to break down these numbers. We appreciate you.
Thank you for having me.